Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I am Jennifer Jones Austin, and I am here with dear friends and colleagues, Maya Wiley and David Jones, for this evening's discussion, the last session of the day in the conference, Full Participation is a Human Right. I'm delighted to be here for what I believe is going to be a riveting conversation as we tackle some of the most pressing issues that center on, our rights as individuals and citizens here in America. Our moderator for the evening, Professor Browne-Marshall, should be with us shortly. We're just experiencing some technical difficulties, but we did not want to waste any time in having this critical conversation. And so we're going to get started, and we're going to begin by just sharing a little bit more about ourselves and why this conversation tonight is so critically important. I'm going to begin with you, Maya.
Well, thank you and good evening, everyone. I am Maya Wiley. I am, I'm currently I'm not sure that this is a nonpartisan event that I should say what I currently am. So let me candidate for mayor of the city of New York, but who I am is a person who spent 30 years working to dismantle structural racism, particularly focused on how we increase opportunities and outcomes in low-income communities of color. Because if we want to ensure that our cities and our communities are growing, are places where we have an excellent education, are places where our housing is affordable, are places where we have dignity at work, and healthcare we need, all the things that we need to live our lives, it means we have to look at the fact that all these things matter, that a whole community matters. And that structural approach to racism is really a way of saying, let's look at where and how we're investing our resources and whether or not we're supporting the folks who have been traditionally discriminated against. Every single time we have fixed systems, it's because we focused on those who are most disadvantaged. That's so often and too often as low-income communities of color. I did that as a civil rights attorney at the ACLU, with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, working for several organizations, and finally founding my own called the Center for Social Inclusion, where our explicit mission was to dismantle structural racism. I did work for the City of New York, for the U.S. Attorney's Office, but most recently I was a senior vice president for social justice at the New School University here in New York, and a professor of public and urban policy. And it's a pleasure to be with you tonight.
Good to be here with you. David?
I'm David Jones. I'm president of the Community Service Society of New York. I've been doing that for a long time. Before that, I was a city official working head of youth services for the city of New York. I've had a long history in doing this. My father founded some of the Black political movements of the 60s and 70s. He was an assemblyman in Central Brooklyn. His club created Unity Democratic, was where Shirley Chisholm emerged. At 16, I was Shirley's dancing partner because I was the only one who knew how to do that. But this whole issue of social justice really came down to me when I was very young. My father who was a civil rights attorney, brought me in to meet one of his clients, a woman whose husband had been taken into a locked cell, shot in the back of the head, and he couldn't get anyone indicted. They refused to indict. This was all routine. I think the reason I'm so passionate about this whole issue is that now, that was the 1950s. We come fast forward to what's happened to Floyd and so many others, and we're still wrestling with this very basic problem of inequality. And we have to use this moment to drive back against what this is about. This is intolerable to see my whole life span dealing with the same problems that I did in the dark days of the 1950s and 60s, where racism was rampant and accepted, and to see it now in 2020 being accepted again. So that's my story, and I hope to participate in this conference. I think it's an extraordinary way to start to engage some of the critical issues.
And I'm Jennifer, as I said, Jennifer Jones Austin, and my journey to this moment in time has everything to do with having grown up in a social justice household. David shared that he was Shirley Chisholm's dance partner. I actually grew up 3 houses down from Shirley Chisholm when she was a U.S. Congresswoman. I grew up in a household of social justice. My father was the president of the New York chapter of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference when King was president, Martin Luther King Jr. He was the president of Operation Breadbasket, which was the economic arm of the the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And he and Dr. King, along with 6 other ministers, founded the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which was the response to the then largest convention, National Baptist Convention, not wanting to get involved in matters of civil rights. And so imagine growing up as a little girl where, the dinner table, the breakfast table, any conversations were about achieving equity, opportunity for Black Americans and for other individuals struggling. It becomes a part of who you are and what you do. And so, my journey is one where I went to law school and then went on to school for policy and management, began working in the field of child welfare, trying to make a difference for children, and quickly appreciating that I could center on child welfare and child care policy, but that if I did not concern myself with the needs and the challenges that present for their parents and their grandparents and other caregivers who struggled with poverty and substance abuse and challenges presenting from having been justice involved, then I really couldn't make a change and a difference for children that would be sustainable. And so I now serve at the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies. It's an organization that is faith-rooted, but increasingly centers on achieving economic equity and justice in other forms for all persons, not just persons of a Protestant background. And that's what I do in the daytime. And then I guess I'm also working increasingly in the justice space. I chair the New York City Board of Correction. We're centering right now on the ending of solitary confinement. And I also just recently was appointed to serve as an advisor in the process of reforming the New York City Police Department. I'm really glad to be here tonight. And now our moderator's back.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think that works out very well. Mercury is in retrograde. My name is Gloria J. Browne-Marshall, and I represent the regular person. I represent the person who grew up in the Midwest and was someone who watched James Baldwin on television one night as a little girl and said, I want to be like him one day. I represent that person who went to school in a family of other educated people, who went to law school, who was bused across town. And I was bused across town in a time period that was not the 1950s. It was not the 1960s. It was the 1970s and 80s. That's because Brown versus Board of Education from 1954 was something that my hometown of Kansas City, Missouri resisted. And I went on to go to school and was one of a handful of Black children and a handful of Black college students, a handful of Black law students. I was always part of a handful, looking forward to one day having full participation. And I think that's why this conference means so much to me, and the work that this organization does means a lot to me. I went on to be a civil rights attorney and working to represent children in different ways. And at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, representing children who were also being bused like I was, and was probably the only lawyer who remembers when I was bused across town, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund attorneys when I was a child, used to peek into my classroom. I didn't know that's who they were at the time. And it wasn't until I was one of those attorneys peeking into the classrooms in public schools to see if desegregation was working, to see what was needed, to see the disparities in resources, that I realized that's who was peeking in my classrooms back when I was bused under Jenkins versus Missouri. I also think about the fact that my background is as a writer, because it was sitting in those motel rooms in Alabama during the time period when I was meeting with my clients, working for the Legal Defense Fund and other organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center, that I had time to write. And I began to ask myself, how long have we been working on these issues? How long have Black parents been fighting this fight? And I went back to the early 1900s and realized it started before that, and went into the 1800s. And it was like, no, wait a minute. This goes all the way back to the 1600s. And so last year, when I was honored to be the chair of the 1619 program for the 400th commemoration of the arrival of 20 Africans into the Virginia colony, it was a full circle for me. Because my first book, Race, Law, and American Society, 1607 to present, takes into account the role of law in oppression. Because the role of law has been one more of an oppressive force than it has been a force of liberation. And so it is with great honor and pleasure that I have a chance coming to this forum as a playwright, as a civil rights attorney, as a person who teaches constitutional law at John Jay College, as someone who works with the media, but also works with the community and grassroots organizations to try to be that bridge between the knowledge that we've attained in the community who so desperately needs it. And this particular panel means a great deal to me, because these panelists are not just giving of their time and energy, of their intellect. These are very busy and very brilliant people, and all of these panelists have been throughout this conference. We are summing up something here that I want to do a little differently, because we're in a pandemic, because we are being gunned down in the street, because so many children are being undereducated at this time, that I'm going to ask these questions of David, Maya, and Jennifer in a way that reaches deep into them, for the topic is fighting. One of my books is A Voting Rights War. We're going to talk about this fight for equality on behalf of all people. We're going to fight from not just the standpoint of the ivory tower, but what we need to tell the person in the street. I want us to be in a conversation that if we were to write this down in a book, and people were to read it and trace the steps they need to fight, I want them to find valuable information here. I want young people like I was when I saw James Baldwin on television and said, I want to be like him one day, an essayist, a playwright, a civil rights activist, a writer. I want to be like that person. I want people to look at our panelists and say, I can fight because they've given me some ground rules. They've inspired me to fight. So fighting for what we need toward a new platform for people in the 21st century is the title of this panel. And let's start. We're going to be asking the panelists questions, and in asking them questions, we're going to expand on it sometimes and sometimes not. It all depends on where they're going with the idea of legacy, with the idea that they have told you their family members have been participating in this. They are not just the people who have inherited, but they're also the people who they have to look to their elders and say, okay, did I do a good job? Have I carried the water? Have I done what I needed to do? I've inherited so much, and for those to whom much is given, much is expected. So let's begin with a question around the vote and political participation. We know that there are over 50 million people who have already voted. They say that this is a larger number than voted in 2016, and we are still almost 2 weeks out until the election day. There's early voting, there's mail-in voting, and there are catastrophes waiting for us at every corner. There is a White House that's undermining the trust and credibility of mail-in ballots, but at the same time, so many people are believing, so many people are excited, so many people are in fear and anticipation, but there are still those who don't feel their democracy is working for them, and we need to speak to them, because those who are already on board are those who believe there's still a chance for change. The vote and the political process is not supposed to be a spiritual experience, but so many people are looking for something that's going to make them jump up and holler. In this time, at this place, tell them why they should still care about their democracy. Why should those people who are sitting back, who have given up on the political process, why should they should vote? And let's start with David with this one. And then from here, we'll go to Maya and Jennifer. David?
Well, I guess this is a privilege of age. So obviously the efforts made by the majority populations to stop us from voting have been devastating. We've been killed trying to vote. But bringing it up for people who want it closer in, right up until the 1950s and the 60s in New York, there were all sorts of efforts to prevent people who in New York City from voting. And actually, my own organization, one of its major achievements early on under Juan Cartagena, who was my general counsel, who now leads Latino Justice, we were seeing the purge of 300,000 voters a year who failed to vote consistently. And we came before a federal judge and were able to show that 95% of the people being purged were African American and Latinos. There was no question that every roadblock to our participation in the democratic process is thrown there. To back away from voting now, at the time, which is going to be critical not only for yourself, but for your children and your grandchildren, is an abdication of everything we've fought for hundreds of years. And therefore, I have to appeal to you that this is the moment. There comes a moment in American history, in Black history, in Latino history, where we have to participate to save ourselves and to save the next generation.
Thank you so much. And Maya?
Well, I let me just say I'm so honored and humbled and moved both by all of you sharing your personal stories. And David is exactly right. Let's say a little bit more concretely about what matters in this election, because I think so much of what we're seeing and the energy in voting is in part because people have heard and seen the explicit behavior that has been targeting communities of color to prevent them from voting. And that includes the lie that is voter fraud as an excuse to make it more difficult for, in particular, people of color to vote because our voting patterns are fairly predictable. And when I say explicit, let's be clear. We have seen an onslaught of efforts to essentially take us back to where we were in the 1950s before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So it's been explicit. It has been about claiming that there's voter fraud to ask for strict IDs and other things. But I think the other aspect to this that we have to acknowledge is understanding that it does make a difference, even if it is not the candidate you're most thrilled about. And what Donald Trump, and I'm not being partisan, I'm using this as a fact-based counterpoint. The fact that Donald Trump as a candidate has been fairly explicit about issues that matter to communities of color has created more of a counterpoint. But let's talk about the Supreme Court, because for the first time, folks, I think, are seeing more clearly just how much an election matters on who sits in some of the most powerful seats in government, and that's the federal bench. And we're seeing it because at stake is whether 20 million Americans will keep or lose their health care insurance, whether or not that in keeping that will include being protected when you have pre-existing conditions. And as we know, in far too many communities of color, there are lots of us, because of a long history of being discriminated against in access to health care, we tend to have more pre-existing conditions. But it's also whether people who are lesbian, gay, transgender will continue to have some recognition of constitutional protections, whether women will have the constitutional protection of the right to control their own reproductive futures, that all these things are much clearer, and it's clear to many voters what directly impacts our lives. So where we may have differences in policies, differences in positions, that the stakes are still very high, and it does make a difference when we choose. And one last thing we should mention, the Electoral College, because as we know at the federal level, in particular, the Electoral College means a minority of people have far too much power over what is now becoming a majority of people who, by the way, are increasingly people of color. And that's part of why we've seen the attack on our system. And what we have to get straight here in our own city is a Bureau of Elections that makes sure that we do not have any more long lines, that we no longer get ballots that are missing a page, and that we have the ability to do proper education. And I applaud our elected leaders that brought us early voting, because that is critical to increase our participation.
Thank you. Thank you. And Jennifer, what do you tell those people who have fallen away or who are no longer a believer in our democratic system and they decided that they're not going to vote this time around? How would you have them listen to you and decide they are going to participate and vote?
So, I just let out a big sigh. Because that is a very big issue. And I don't know if people really appreciate how big an issue it is. I had the good fortune of weekly doing a radio show, a nationally syndicated radio show with Reverend Al Sharpton. It's a 3-hour show where we talk to people from all over the country. And it actually is a very diverse caller base. I then on Sunday mornings, I'm the co-host of a local radio show, WBLS's Open Line. And then I also often do a nationally syndicated show, The Karen Hunter Show, where we talk with people about what is happening in America. And we spend a lot of time talking about the upcoming election. Apathy is widespread. People feeling dispirited, feeling dismayed, widespread. And it has a lot to do with their lack of belief in the democratic process. I'll give you one example that really brings this home that surprised me in some respects. Not everybody was happy. Not everybody you think would be happy was happy about the choosing of Kamala Harris as the vice president nominee with Joe Biden. Young people, a lot of young persons of color weren't feeling her at all. And I'm using weren't in the past tense because I hope that they're coming along, and that's just my personal opinion. Let me tell you why. What I heard, what they repeatedly said. They said that Kamala Harris ran for president of the United States and did not win one of the state primaries, that she actually came in on the lower end at every turn. They said that they felt that the voters demonstrated to America that she was not who they believed should be president. And then the Democratic Party and Joe Biden turned around and said that she would be the vice president nominee. And they said, so we told you she shouldn't be president, but then you turned around and you put her there, and now she's got like kind of a back door in should Biden be elected and something happened to him and he passed away. They said that doesn't really seem like our votes really matter. And then they looked over at the Republicans and what has been happening with partisan politics there, a lot of what Maya spoke to, and they said, well, who do we even trust and believe in this process? They even looked back to 2016, some of them saying that, it was long decided before people even went to the polls that Hillary Clinton should be the Democrat nominee and not others. And so they feel dispirited. They feel that it really doesn't matter what they do. And the concern that I have is that people are quick to say, it doesn't matter if your candidate didn't win, you've got to be a part of this, without really hearing what their discontent is all about, their disenchantment, and why they're disconnected. I'm concerned that this dispiritedness, this apathy will extend beyond this election, perhaps even if the person or the people who they think maybe are best able to lead in this moment, even if they are elected. And so what I'm trying to do is actually in some ways move beyond this specific election and help them to appreciate why their votes actually matter. That if they step out of the process now, this is really the only space and place where you do have an opportunity to let your voice and your thoughts be heard in America. And especially if you're not somebody sitting with privilege and power. I tell them all the time that politicians really do pay attention. Why has there been so much centering on the Black woman in this general election? Because we saw how Black women helped to usher in the most diverse Congress, in 2018. We saw how Black women brought about the election in Alabama of Doug Jones. And that's why the Democratic Party has centered on Black Americans and Black women in particular. I talked to them about how your vote really does matter. Because if we look at the 2016 election, we see how Trump actually won with less than 80,000 votes because he won in states where people didn't come out in droves. The number of people who were registered, I should say the number of people who voted paled in comparison to those who were registered. And so he won by 20,000 votes in Wisconsin, a few more in Pennsylvania, a few less in Michigan. I try to help them understand your vote really does matter. In New York City, de Blasio won, he says, by a landslide in 2013 because he won 75% of the vote, but only 25% of the people who were eligible to vote actually did. So votes do matter. You can swing elections. The other thing that I tell them is that in this present day, with voter suppression and voter purging, if you don't vote, you don't know when they're going to take you off the rolls and you don't even know it. So there will be people showing up on election day or in early voting to vote. And because they didn't vote in like the last major election or two in their states, they may have actually been purged. So what I try to do is help them understand that, yes, their vote can swing an election. I try to help them understand that their vote is a representation, a reflection of their voice, and politicians are paying attention, and that if they don't, they actually may lose it, even though they didn't intend it.
Thank you so much. And as you can see, we have a spirited discussion, but we want people to know that we just want to remind our audience and esteemed panelists that this is a nonpartisan event, and we ask that you refrain from making any partisan commentary. Thank you.
Fine.
I also want to add, because I work with legal history, and my book, The Voting Rights War, had a foreword by the late Reverend C.T. Vivian. And it was amazing to me the timing that John Lewis and C.T. Vivian died on the same day. C.T. Vivian was also a lieutenant for and an advisor to Martin Luther King. And if you go online to YouTube, you can see C.T. Vivian putting up what is such a valiant, nonviolent fight for voting rights. When we think about this is the 100th anniversary of the woman gaining the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, but it's also the 150th anniversary of Black men gaining the right to vote with the 15th Amendment that was ratified in 1870. And in 1870, we had Black U.S. senators, Black U.S. congresspersons. We had over 8,000 Black men in offices, state, local, and federal offices. But we don't know about that because, as Jennifer pointed out, it was wiped out of history by the Ku Klux Klan, John Birch Society, and other supremacists, as well as our U.S. Supreme Court, as Maya Wiley has pointed out. And the effect of the U.S. Supreme Court on civil rights, on voting rights, has been usually, a stunning undercutting of voting rights. We had a little window of opening under a particular courts, but overall we saw in 2013 the gutting of the preclearance provision of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that was paid for with blood, sweat, and tears. And so here we are with photo ID, with Texas having one drop box per county, with people, as pointed out, purged. And as David Jones has said, he started his career knowing that it wasn't just the law, but violence that undermined our progress at every step. So as we think about the right to vote, and we think about those Black women from Sojourner Truth to Ida B. Wells Barnett, to Mary Church Terrell, Fannie Lou Hamer, we know we're sick and tired of being sick and tired, but we also have to be sick and tired of being oppressed enough to go out and actually vote. We turn to something that is a topic of importance to all three of you, and that is our economy. And not just our economy thought of in a robust way, but those people who are on the fringes of our economy. The war on poverty began as part of President Lyndon Johnson's State of the Union address in January of 1964. And we looked at the war on poverty as an extension from the New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the time period of the Great Depression. During Bill Clinton's administration, we had what he deemed a way to make sure that the welfare system would never be the same again, and it really hasn't been. He wanted to end the welfare system as we know it. And now here we are in the country that one candidate for president brags to be the greatest country on earth with the greatest economy. And he's done more for Black people, almost as much as Abraham Lincoln in his mind. But we also know that poverty in this country of economic wealth is something that is rampant. So I ask you, and I'll begin once again with David, how far have we come since the war on poverty? And why does poverty still remain so high in America?
Well, pre-pandemic, we were showing signs in New York City, which I know best, of 20% unemployment of people who were Black and brown were under the poverty line. It's 24,000 for a family of three. But what I'm concerned about is that grossly underestimates what's happening post-pandemic. The job losses and where they take place have disproportionately hit low-wage people of all races, but particularly Black and brown people. And actually getting back to what Jennifer Jones-Austin was talking about, why you have to politically participate and why you can't depend on parties of whatever sort, is that if there is a return to potentially a Democratic Party, there will be another fight to be had. The fight to ensure that our constituents and the people we care about get what they're going to need to climb back to a better level of economic effort. And we have to recognize, and I think for many of the young people who have concerns about the political process, that the default position of politicians, once they've achieved majorities, is to try to protect the parts of the population or parts of their constituency to ensure their majority. And that's why not only we have to participate in this election, but we have to drive those in power to make sure they deliver on supports that are going to be necessary, even to have some modicum of equilibrium here, to bring back unemployment rates, which in certain communities, in the Black and brown communities of New York, are approaching 30% unemployment. We're going to need a major investment of the scale of the war on poverty to try to climb back out of this. And to assume that just this election, everything will be fine, everything will go back, it won't. Therefore, this is the opening gun of a major effort, political effort, that's going to have to be undertaken to ensure that whoever's in power delivers, not only for Black and brown people, Julius Wilson, who is my icon, who's one of the leading experts, but for all the low-wage people in America who have been devastated by what's happened here. Because that's the formulation that's going to lead to political change. And we've got to recognize that that's going to have to be the fight to come.
Thank you. And Jennifer, as the CEO of the Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, please tell us, why are we still wrestling with the poverty rates, and how far have we come, and what do we need to do to really make a difference?
So I begin with your question, answer your question by saying that the reason that we are still wrestling with poverty in America is because even though the nation embarked upon a war against poverty dating back to 1964, when you look back on it, it really appears to be a war to manage poverty, not a war to end poverty. What I mean by that is that a lot of the poverty, the anti-poverty programs that came out of the war on poverty, that came about with the, I believe it was the Great Society and the Economic Opportunities Act. A lot of those programs, Medicaid, Medicare, Head Start, food support, they manage poverty. They help people who are tinkering on the fringes of poverty. They keep them from falling in or keep them from falling deeper, but they don't really create robust opportunity for people who are deeply in poverty to get out and get ahead. I sometimes think about the question of, why we still have a poverty measure that David just spoke to that really isn't a true measure of poverty. I think that's by design. If we, as a nation, suggest that all of these programs have helped us to reduce nationwide the number of people who are living in poverty using an antiquated, dated measure that centers on food as being the greatest expense of a household, when we know today that rent, housing is the greatest expense, we know that we are undercounting the number of people who are struggling to meet their basic needs. And that's how we define poverty. So when you have a poverty measure that says that a family of three, if they're making above 24,000, they're not in poverty, or a family of four making above 25,600, they're not living in poverty. But you look at New York City alone, where it may cost, as much as $100,000 to meet your housing, your food, your transportation, and your childcare costs. You know that we're undercounting the number of people who are struggling to make ends meet. I think that's by design. So these programs are helping people to put food on the table, helping to pay their rent, but they're not helping to create real robust economic opportunity and upward mobility. And I think that we're only really going to address these issues and really help move the needle, not just for people who are on the fringes, but people who are in deep poverty, 100, 200% below the poverty line, until we really start focusing on advancing upward mobility, centering on jobs and wages, education, affordable housing, and access to higher wage opportunities. We're not going to really end this war, overcome it and end it.
So I'm assuming, okay, I didn't, thank you, Gloria, but really also thank you, David and Jennifer. I'm going to say it more pointedly, but it's an agreement. We never had a war on poverty. We had a very brief skirmish that as we started to win the skirmish, we then said, we're done here. And then, because the war on poverty itself, Lyndon Baines Johnson's program was tops 6 years. 6 years, because he was too busy fighting the war in Vietnam to actually be fighting a war on poverty. And part of what has happened, and I say this, my own personal story is with, a father, parents who were in the civil rights movement, Congress on Racial Equality, frustrated that as the civil rights movement was fighting for racial justice, that we still weren't making a significant enough impact on the daily lives of Black community in terms of the ability to put food on the table, the ability to develop wealth, the ability to buy a home, the ability to get even just basic needs and services. And that, for my father, who started organizing Black women on welfare, it was fundamentally to fight to say, because we weren't ever creating a system that gave women who were also raising children, since that's what the welfare program was at that time, even enough money to put them in a decent home or to ensure that they could feed their kids through the month in the system, in the quote unquote anti-poverty system. And the other thing that we did to them and still do is penalize them for the poverty that we created. And what I mean by that is, if you look at how we developed a middle class in this country, and I'm sure many of you already know this history, but I'll just touch on a couple of the high points. We constructed it. We constructed it coming out of the Great Depression because we said, we're going to make sure as a federal government that you get help to buy a home. We're going to federally back your mortgage. But when we did that, which was a huge creator of a middle class, we essentially excluded communities of color. And so we created a mostly white middle class. We said, veterans, when you're returning from war, having served your country, we're going to make sure that you get our help to pay for you to go to college. And then we're going to have additional help to help you get a job after you come out of college. But what did we do? We discriminated against people of color, including Japanese, right? People of color, in whether or not they could even serve in the military in World War II. And then even the few who were able to be in the programs got discriminated against in the programs. So I'm saying that because that poverty is basically a refusal of policymakers to invest fairly in exactly what Jennifer is talking about, in the ability to build wealth through homeownership, in the ability to have a high level quality education that you can turn into a good paying job. And that for people who don't have that, because we never, ever helped them with it, we then say, something is wrong with you. It's your fault because you're making some mistake. And we ignore the fact that we literally penalize them by saying, and just all you have to do is read some of the articles coming out on what we're doing to homeless children right here in New York City right now, which is we're going to require your parents to pull you out of school, to take you and sit in an office for 6-7 hours, missing school to prove that you're a parent with a child in order to try to get out of shelter into some form of permanent housing. And even that's elusive, right? So we literally penalize people for not having enough when we never gave them enough. And then we blame them then for the consequences of the way we torture them because we decide we want to judge them for the fact that we never gave them what they needed in the first place to get a fair shot. And that is not a war. That's not even a skirmish. That's actually being on the wrong side of the fence. And that's what we can change.
And once again, I want people to know, I wrote a book, Race, Law, and American Society, and we are all people with law backgrounds here. Law played a role in every level of this. The GI Bill was a law passed by Congress, and yet redlining and other ways, other mechanisms to get around this was supposed to be a benefit for all people coming back from military service, ended up being one of the ways in which it was pointed out, created a suburb. And why did they fly to the suburb? White flight was because of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, and the response to it is to abandon our city schools and move out to the suburbs. But race discrimination, law, and violence were put together in a way to undermine the progress of African Americans and other people of color. This idea of law and violence has been part of the American lifestyle for some time. The effect has been generational traumas. It has been the undermining of our economic and political abilities. It has been a way in which we are undermined with as far as our educational attainment. So now it brings me to the next question. And that question is a controversial one of reparations. So now what do? There are people who are saying one of the reasons why they don't support either candidate is because neither candidate supports reparations. But then there's also this issue of what would reparations mean? We know in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the cruelty of having one of the rallies on the very day that was the date of the massacres in Tulsa, Oklahoma of African-American communities, of Black Wall Street by white mobs, where hundreds upon thousands were left homeless. Businesses were destroyed, because we also know from Rosewood to Tulsa to East St. Louis, the Red Summer of 1919 took place in the midst of the Spanish flu 100 years ago, the same way we have a pandemic today. Generation after generation has faced violence and legal oppression. So when we talk about the topic of reparations, what does reparations mean to you? And how do we repair the damage of slavery and Jim Crow segregation and the ongoing vestiges of slavery and Jim Crow segregation affecting our lives? And let's start with Jennifer.
I think it's important that as we have this conversation, we first and foremost center on why some people are down with it, some people aren't. Even persons of color, have challenged the notion of whether or not we should have reparations. And when the conversations and the challenges that I've heard often center on people feeling like it challenges. They don't actually verbalize this, but it sounds like their reasoning challenges this notion of the American dream and this belief that, with good and hard work and sacrifice, you can make it here in America. And so we look to Black Americans and we say they just aren't working hard enough. The way of the bootstrapper, why can't they get themselves together? Persons come from other nations, other persons of color, and they seem to do all right here in America. What's wrong with the Black American? It's not because of slavery and Jim Crow and Black codes and, the criminalization of poverty and the war against drugs that was fought in Black communities. It has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with the Black American just really doesn't work hard enough. So that's one of the things that, they put out there. That's why we shouldn't do it. They just worked harder. I think that it also requires America to acknowledge and take accountability for the original sin, that is racism in the form of slavery. And people today say, well, that wasn't me. And that wasn't my mother. That wasn't my grandmother. So why are you holding me accountable? And then people say the pie isn't big enough. We just don't have enough. It challenges people's sense of privilege, or they're not wanting to recognize their privilege in America. And so I think until we really deal with those issues, it's going to be hard to really get into a conversation about what reparations actually means and what it should look like. But what I'm going to tell you is that I think it's real meaningful restitution for those initial harms, and then how they've been perpetuated from generation to generation to generation over the last 400 years. I'll give you a great example of what I mean. I have a freshman at the University of Virginia, and shortly before taking him to the campus back in September, we began receiving updates from the campus about how they were handling COVID-19 and other happenings on the campus. And one Saturday morning in August, I got a note about them creating a monument, a memorial in recognition of the 4,000 slaves, beginning with Thomas Jefferson's slaves, who helped build, who actually built the University of Virginia, the public University of Virginia, public university. So I get all excited. I want to go see this monument. We've got to see it when we drop off our son. And so we got down there a few hours before he had to, move him in, and we went to see the monument. And as I began touring this stone monument right in the center of campus, I was filled with a sense of pride and gratitude and joy. And all of a sudden I realized it didn't take long. It was about 5 minutes before I became angry. I found myself reading the names of slaves, and sometimes they had dashes because they didn't know the names of slaves. but they were trying to take note of the 4,000 that at one point or another had been recorded as having built the University of Virginia. Why did I become angry? Because I started thinking to myself, this is the best that you can do? A monument that pays tribute for the descendants to come and see their ancestors' names, or maybe guess, maybe this was my ancestor or that was? When there are Black Americans throughout the state of Virginia who are the descendants of these slaves, you know what, UVA? You know what, state of Virginia? Think about giving them free or discounted tuition as a start. That's what reparations looks like. Make sure that you ensure that their children, these slaves, that their descendants and the descendants of their descendants have access to one of the best education systems in this country. That's what reparations looks like.
Thank you. And so let's turn to Maya.
Whew, so amen. So if we say a little bit more about, I think, how broken the United States is. One of the things that is so broken about the United States is that, exactly as Jennifer said, we have this conversation about who's deserving and who's not, who earned and who didn't. But also, let's take COVID as a crisis, right? We have these conditions we have created because we haven't sufficiently as a country invested in affordable housing or invested in affordable healthcare or childcare or any of the things every single person needs in this country, right? And then COVID happens, and we already see, even the middle class is squeezed by housing. Even the middle class is squeezed on affordability, on the ability to pay for healthcare as healthcare insurance costs rise, on all the things. There's no childcare per se, and the average family spending $20,000 a year or something crazy, right? Just for their kids to be safe and sound somewhere while they work. And then that means that when we have communities of color, for all the reasons we've already talked about, where then you're twice as likely to die from COVID. You're twice as likely to be in a situation where you're an essential worker, having to go to work and leaving your kids, right? Sometimes not even with internet access to be even able to get online. So everybody's impacted by COVID. Everybody was impacted by the hard time it was to afford to live in the city before COVID. But yet we're not all impacted to the same degree, depending on that history. So one of the ways we have to start thinking about this is what, a friend and mentor of mine calls targeted universalism. So that's very wonky, right? But what do I really mean by that? What I really mean by that is everybody needs affordable housing. Everybody needs healthcare. Everybody needs childcare. Everybody needs a job that helps pay the rent and that treats them with dignity. But we should invest to the degree the communities can get them. And some communities are going to need more to be caught up to actually get that opportunity. That's to Jennifer's point about, we had a GI Bill and it discriminated against people of color, but it dang sure got some folks a high level of education and a good job that enabled them to pay a mortgage and get the next generation to college. So for the kids who didn't have that, who because of that history Jennifer's talking about look like those of us on the Zoom right now, that means for those folks, they should have enough to ensure that that happens, right? So that doesn't ignore that there is need in communities that are white, because we should not ignore that the number of people who are poor in this country who are white in number is actually a greater number, which is why people get confused about race. But if we actually talked about wealth, we'd also start to recognize that, yeah, and you know what? If a family that is white earning a working class or blue collar wage has $15,000 more in wealth than a Black family that is earning $150,000 a year, that tells us that race is at play. That's not just a class issue. And so we just have to look at it with the sophistication that says everybody should have this. and we invest to the degree that ensures that everyone gets it. And for people who are Black and people who are Latino and others, Native American, all need some form of reparation for the different ways in which racism played out in history that created a deeper and different kind of investment need so that we really all do have the same opportunities.
And I know these questions I'm asking would be one, and all of them would take an hour or days for us to go into more detail. And you can, of course, feel the passion of this panel around these very important issues. But David, please, your view on this issue of reparations.
There's no question that reparations are absolutely necessary. Building the political will to get it done is what I'm most focused on. It was interesting. My organization is 175 years old, and I remember going out to a predominantly Irish community and showing them the news editorials by the Brooklyn Eagle and the New York Tribune associating the Irish with apes. They weren't really human. And saying, you have to put yourself into the understanding that the death rate among the Irish was extraordinary because of the racist attitudes. And then see the connection between what's happening to African American and Latinos with the suffering, a whole generation you've suffered. And I don't think we've made the connection effectively enough, because that's going to be part of the healing process where people recognize, wait a minute, this isn't just them. The fact that 2/3 of my generation before me died because of racist attitudes towards the Irish and the Jews and the Italians. This is part of the same kind of racist underpinning that destroyed a whole generation before. We haven't made the connection yet. And I think it's imperative that we look at the class structures and the racist attitudes that impacted the Asian other groups in America to try to forge a consensus here. But I think Maya is absolutely right. The broad-based programs that stick, whether that's Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security, all had broad-based implications, but were restricted substantially to a certain group. We have to broaden that discussion in order to make sure we come up with a program that is going to reach everybody, but particularly has enormous impact with our communities. We desperately need it.
Well, and we know that the federal government, state and local governments, the U.S. Supreme Court, as we say, the role of law has been one of oppressor more often than it has been of liberator. The 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, we know that there were so many Supreme Court decisions between the time period in which slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, except as punishment for a crime, and that was in 1865. In 1868, we have the 14th Amendment giving citizenship at birth, privileges and immunities, due process, and the Equal Protection Clause. And of course, as I mentioned before, Black men gained the right to vote. There is this progress. The first Black female attorney is Charlotte Ray in 1872, a graduate of Howard Law School. We have these major institutions like Tuskegee Institute and Howard University, Spelman College. We have all of these institutions. We start having, of course, this wealth that we're building. And it's the first Black millionaire coming out of the 1800s. And of course, the backlash of Plessy versus Ferguson with the doctrine of segregation around the nation, not just the Black and white, for all people of color. In the midst of all this, we have Callie House. Callie House is the first person to actually raise the issue of reparations. She begins this pension fund, but what happens? They decide they're going to arrest Callie House, K-A-C-A-L-L-I-E, Callie House, arrest her for fraud. The criminal justice system triggered, not just from that 13th Amendment, slavery is abolished except as punishment for a crime, which triggers the convict lease system, triggers mass incarceration, but it also triggers not just the failure of policing to protect us during periods of lynching, but too many law enforcement agents who have risen up from a system that was based in slave catching, based in the militia that was supposed to put down Native American uprisings, and then a sprinkling in of the bobbies of England that are all part of what we created in our criminal justice system. Our systems, the Voting Rights Act, went to or tried to uproot some of the racism in our voting system. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 tried to uproot some of the racism in housing. The 1964 Civil Rights Act tried to uproot some of the racisms in other areas like education and Brown versus Board of Education, as well as employment. But we've not had any national reform to even look at, let alone uproot the racism embedded in our criminal justice system. Callie House went to prison for attempting to create reparations, giving some pension to those former slaves. The formerly enslaved received nothing. The criminal justice system has been triggered either by not protecting us or by over-policing us. The prosecutor's office has often failed to prosecute those who harm us, but prosecute those who say we have harmed others based only on their word. National criminal justice reform, change, transformation, whatever we want to call it, requires so much. However, how do you speak to younger generations? Why should they have any hope in our criminal justice system? What can you say to younger generations when it comes to our criminal justice system and criminal justice reform? And we will start. This time we're going to move and start with Maya.
Well, I wish I was going last on this one in part because I actually feel like they're telling us. And I think that's important to listen to because so much of what we're thinking about criminal justice reform and how we're thinking of it is informed by a generation that is growing up saying, we're done here. We're done here. It makes no sense for us to say criminalize, smoking marijuana when you can drink alcohol legally, and then tell us that we're going to spend, possibly years, maybe even decades in prison, even though we hurt no one. And then you're going to tell us we can't get a job when we come out because we have that record. And by the way, when we were in the system, got no access to an education. And so I have been one who has been learning from a generation that is kind of telling us what we did not do enough of. And I think, Laura, you named one of the places of power that folks have been building is to say we want to elect district attorneys who are going to recognize that it isn't just about what police do and what police decide to arrest on and use their discretion to criminalize. It's whether you decide you're going to prosecute. And as we saw here in Brooklyn with Ken Thompson, who we miss dearly, but that has been continued, who said, you can bring me NYPD all the low-level drug cases you want, marijuana cases you want. I'm just not going to prosecute them. So I actually have the power as an elected official to use my discretion as a prosecutor to say no. And that I'll use my power as a prosecutor to open up the kind of, I actually forgot what they call them, but they still do them, but where they'll say so many people have a warrant out for their arrest, they don't even know they have a warrant out for the arrest because maybe they got handed a summons to show up in court. They didn't show up for whatever reason. Maybe they lost the summons. Maybe they forgot about the court date. And the next thing you know, they have an arrest warrant. They don't even know it. And then they get arrested. Well, so they started having these fairs where they said, come and we'll tell you whether you have an arrest warrant. And if it's for something, we'll expunge it. But that's a way of saying we're going to change the equation because we're also, like we were talking about elections earlier in this panel, where including young people have said, we see an opportunity to use our vote as power in impacting the discretion that too long has been used against us to criminalize behavior that shouldn't be treated as a crime. And we are going to demand that that happen more and more and more. And also, as we saw in the context of protests and Black Lives Matter protests that we saw in New York City and also around the country after George Floyd, a demand that says, you know what, rather than investing in calling someone with a badge and a gun when what we have is a mental health crisis, let's take that money and invest it in being able to respond to a mental health crisis. That is a kind of reform that we are hearing from young activists. So in a way, I would just, say that if we are listening, what we are hearing are the solutions that we have to be a part of that are saying, let's be rational, let's be smart, and let's invest in our communities and let's build the opportunity. So, for example, it is easier to get a job than a gun, and that we have people who are using their decision-making power that are accountable to us to use their power and discretion in a way that keeps us out of the system rather than pushing us into the system. And that, I know, is something that we should be listening to.
And so, David, as Maya's pointed out, as we have these conversations with younger generations, and they are telling us, I'm so proud of their protests. I'm proud that they have taken the situation in hand and they've gone forward and said enough is enough. From Eric Garner to Breonna Taylor to, of course, George Floyd and so many others. The police kill, or at least civilians die at the hands of 1,000 people a year. And that's only because we started keeping record of this. So when we're having these conversations with younger generations and they're speaking to us and we're talking with them about our institutional knowledge, what is it that we say about the criminal justice system?
As someone of my generation who was warned never to interact with police because it was dangerous, of having been stopped and frisked, been having a gun held to my head, just being a kid. It's hard to talk about this. You see it everywhere. I joined the board of the MTA 4 years ago, and as a regular reporting, they mentioned the stops and arrests that were taking place in the subways. More than 100,000 stops, 30,000 arrests, 95% were Black and brown. And this seemed just normal. And when you ask the police who are dealing with this, so that's where we go where the crime is. When Staten Island happens to be the highest incidence of fare evasion anywhere in the city of New York. So it's almost open. You can't gainsay what young people are saying. They're seeing what's real. They're seeing under even progressive administrations the toleration of abuse of Black and brown young people, particularly. And I think Maya's exactly right. We have to start to examine why prosecutions are taking place. I mean, we've made headway on the silly marijuana charges that are suddenly, that's ridiculous. We're going after people for that. We don't go after people for getting drunk. Moreover, I think the understanding that this is disproportionately impacting communities of color is so overt that it can't be tolerated anymore. And I think the move of trying to get new prosecutors involved in this and also overhaul of a policing system that is focusing on low-level crime and not protecting the public. This was very clear. 70% of the work of NYPD in the subways was fare evasion. When my daughter or son-in-law is riding the subways, they're not particularly concerned about fare evaders. They are concerned about violent crime and being pushed on the tracks. Yet all the work was dominated in communities of color trying to stop fare evaders at a cost that exceeded the fare evasion return. And this was clearly racist. And I think bringing those issues up, sometimes it feels like open field running, I must admit. Everywhere I look, you see examples of this kind of abuse going on. And, you know, whether it's selling Lucy cigarettes, which is ridiculous, to fare evasion, which is ridiculous, to marijuana arrests, which is ridiculous. You're using supposedly highly trained professionals with guns to deal with problems that no one in the public, if they had a poll, would consider a major issue for them. And you have to look at it as suppression of people of color. That goes back to the 1600s, 1700s, that this was a device to keep one group or another down. So I think people opening their eyes to this, and elected officials and policymakers starting to recognize this, is going to be vital going forward, not only for New York City, but across the nation. And hopefully what the young people have done with the Black Lives Matters and other efforts of that sort is to start to open this discussion to a broader a group of people to understand just how pernicious this becomes.
And thank you, David. I believe in litigation, legislation, and protest. This trifecta creates social change: litigation, legislation, and protest. But litigation has become criminal justice system in which, as was pointed out, the prosecutors don't prosecute. They become completely inept when the defendant is a police officer or the suspect is a police officer. I believe that we should have a whistleblower's office within the prosecutor's office so that those bad prosecutors can be taken out, or at least we know who they are because they stand behind a wall of silence that is as thick as the wall of silence, the blue wall of silence for police officers. But in the end, when it comes to criminal justice, Jennifer, and we have these conversations with young people, we are in a system of criminal justice. We have thousands upon thousands, I believe it's 18,000 police jurisdictions around the country. And this criminal justice system is triggering all of these other issues that we've already discussed. So now, how do we talk to, intergenerationally anyway, how do we talk to other people, younger people, about a criminal justice system that seems to be everywhere and so resistant to change?
This is a heavy topic, because the challenge that I have with this is that we of course we have to center on the racialization of the criminal justice system, but all of these other systems that contribute to the system and the prevalence of over policing and racialized policing, all of these systems, racialized poverty, racialized education, racialized healthcare, racialized mental health care, racialized inequity, all of these contribute to the criminal justice or injustice system. My organization, FPWA, several years ago, released a report titled "Ending the Poverty to Prison Pipeline," where we found that here in New York City, 60% of the crimes committed in New York City are attributable to poverty, and 80% of the people who are incarcerated in the jails are poor. Maybe we'll see that change now because of bail reform. We looked at the community districts with the highest rates of incarceration, and of course, they were also the community districts with the highest rates of over-policing. And lo and behold, they were also the community districts with the highest rates of people of color and poverty. And so we began to understand that in this society, we've criminalized poverty. We talk most often about racialized criminal justice, but it's race, it's the intersection of race, poverty, and justice, or injustice in the main. And what I'm really centering on right now, I'm actually in an interesting place. I mentioned when I first introduced myself that I serve as the chair of the Board of Correction for the City of New York. So I've been in and out of the jails, and I came to appreciate very quickly that whereas criminal justice, or being in jail and being imprisoned, seems to be the end of the road, for many, it's actually the beginning of another road. for persons who are justice involved, their families, their children, once they become justice involved, now are finding themselves in a system that it is difficult to navigate. They find themselves falling deeper and deeper in poverty, becoming disconnected, increased mental health challenges, substance abuse. We find that that these persons, those needs are not being met. And so what I'm really centering on is, yes, we've got to do the work of reforming the justice system. We need to look at who we elect and who we appoint as prosecutors, and whether or not they are engaged in more progressive practices when it comes to sentencing, when it comes to what they will and will not prosecute with respect to lower level crimes, when it comes to alternatives to prosecution to begin with, alternatives to detention, alternatives to incarceration. We need to center on that, but we also, and it's tied to the defunding of the police, we need to center on how do we engage in real community development and real community reforms. There are prosecutors across the nation who've been taking some of the windfall money that have come from settlements for white collar crimes and other, and putting those monies back into the community to invest in youth centers, in youth education support programs, recreational programs. We need to be centering on that. My biggest concern when we talk about defund the police, I'm all for it, defunding in the sense of disinvesting and reinvesting, but we've got to remember that these other systems are also racialized. We have racialized healthcare and mental health care. We have racism that pervades the education system, the human services, social services system, where people show up with their own biases about Black and brown people and low income people. And so it's not just it's not just the answer. There's no magic pill when you disinvest and reinvest. We need to be centering on alternatives to prosecution, alternatives to detention, incarceration. But when we do that, looking at and making sure that we're not now reinvesting in systems that themselves are racialized. So that's what I'm centering on.
Thank you. We're going to move to education, as Jennifer has mentioned, and these are all racialized systems because racism and racialized viewpoints of people all of that is part of the original sins of America, along with the genocide of the Native Americans upon whose land we are sitting at this moment. In the New York Times, and this is Thursday, the article on education is a top issue for parents, even if politicians haven't said so. The issue of education is a very important one. 7 months now, many of our young people have been out of school or in marginalized schools or being educated remotely. Parents are having to choose between educating their children and working their jobs. There are times in which the digital divide has created such an inaccuracy and amount of money, time, and effort that the city may say that it's putting into a child's education, but we don't know. We don't know what the measurements are going to be because it's been so difficult to determine if these children are anywhere near on track. Some of them are excelling because they have private tutors, but most children of color are falling way behind. And I have had parents ask me, and so I am asking you this question. What can parents do as activists for their children and to navigate the educational system? What is it that they can do in representing their family's interests? Because they are the ones on the ground. They see what is happening in their households. And yet, because of the pandemic and because of the digital divide, because of the lack of access to communication with their elected officials, they are struggling too often alone. What do you have to say to these parents? And if we may, shall we begin with Maya?
Well, let's start by saying you're right. Like, parents need to hear you're right. the things you're concerned about, upset about, outraged about is right. I say that because so often parents don't even get validated about the fact that they can believe what they are seeing. They know what they are seeing, and we saw it in COVID. So, but let's talk about where we are right now. We have the opportunity because of COVID to completely reimagine what we even mean by public education. COVID, for horrible reasons, blew the curtains back on exactly how inequitable and broken the school system is, right? I don't mean we didn't know it before COVID, but I mean it was undeniable because not everyone understood that we had literally, 150,000 kids who are homeless, that we had literally almost 750,000 kids struggling just to have enough broadband to get online, to do online education, not even taking into account of parents who were essential and had no choice to work. And we had families where a fourth grade student was stopping and interrupting their schoolwork that they were doing online, even if they were lucky enough to be able to be online, to help the first grade sibling with their work online because a parent had to work like that. So we should recognize that the public health crisis reinforced for us that, yes, our schools are overcrowded. And now that we're not talking about overcrowded educationally, which they are, but they're overcrowded from a public health standpoint, right? We have a vacancy rate in this city in terms of commercial space, in terms of other kinds of space in the city. So that's an opportunity for parents to say, well, why aren't we using our resources as a city to take advantage of this to create new models of education, experiment with it, create innovative schools that are much smaller and maybe even project-based, right? We have parents, because students themselves call for it, saying to us, why are we learning this way? By you giving me tons of books and reading, and then you're testing me on it, rather than by giving me projects to solve really hard problems and then supporting me with the resources to solve them in a team, because that's what employers are looking for. And I can tell you as an educator, as someone who served by teaching, and yes, graduate level, but also what I was hearing from high school students in New York City is they want to learn differently, because the ways we are teaching is 19th century education in a 21st century world. So what we have the opportunity to do is not just return to the demands that predated COVID, but to think about, what is it that parents really want? What is it that their kids really want? And say, that's what you have to ask for, and forget about the old rules. Forget about the box. COVID blew the lid off of it, slammed down the sides. And now more than ever, we have the opportunity to say, not just smaller class size for smaller class size for public health. Not just learning from one another. Yes, we must learn from one another, right? We must have a school system where our kids, we recognize that all our diversity in the city is a learning asset, both for critical thinking skills, for social and emotional learning, for all kinds of reasons, but that we now have an opportunity not just to remove some of the stuff that was broken from before in our admission systems, but to actually think about how we're creating innovative schools that parents and kids want to be in, and that has a very different kind of education in it as content. And so that opportunity means parents can and must be encouraged and supported to say, ask for what you really want. Don't be limited by the old rules that didn't serve us then. Be empowered by the innovation that this crisis has demanded of all of us.
And fighting for what we need, remember, is the title of this program for today, this panel discussion. And so, David, what do you say to these parents who are juggling between a living space that may not have been large enough for them to begin with, but they had that time away that now they're home, or some of them are service workers on the front line, afraid of getting COVID and bringing it home to their children at home trying to be educated. They have the digital divide. There's one laptop. Everyone is trying to move forward, but they feel that nothing is helping them, especially as their children fall further behind. What do you say to these parents who want to be activists on behalf of their children?
In this area, and I'll just pick up on some of what Maya said, pre-COVID, the inequity in the educational system is so profound as to be. So when I was growing up, I went to PS 138 in Crown Heights. We never had a permanent teacher. We had substitute teachers, never got books delivered. Some years ago, I went back to PS 138. The same condition existed. And it's all because of race. So we've done investigations looking at high schools in the city of New York. If you're in a predominantly Black and brown community, you probably don't have full laboratory conditions as opposed to Bronx Science and Stuyvesant, which has almost no Black and Latinos existing in it. The racial inequities in our educational system is perhaps so profound in New York that it beggars description. We're ahead of some of the southern cities in terms of its inability to serve children of color educationally. And I think that now persists, obviously, post-COVID in the kind of situation we have. I think the gap that's a chasm now that's developed in education because of COVID is going to have a generational impact of putting our young people so far behind that they're never able to catch up unless there's some extraordinary investment. But this is an area that's almost atavistic. Middle class, particularly non-minority parents, have gotten the lion's share of resources in our public education system. We've created a private education system for some, where the PTAs and the rest can provide adequate resources, as opposed to something in Crown Heights and Ocean Hill, Brownsville, and other areas where they can barely get by. We look at high schools where AP courses are not even being offered in many schools that are essentially catering to Black and Latino kids. And in the world we're entering into, this is devastating. We're putting young people in the position where they'll never be able to compete and justify the assumptions that we're not capable. So I think this is perhaps one of the most serious areas, but the most harshly resisted areas in the city and cities across the country. So I think if we can use this moment to start to open up this whole issue, I think it'll be worthwhile. But the resistance we've met from parents all over the place and from elected officials and the rest is one of the most persistent problems we've had in the city of New York in my lifetime.
And we will have time for questions and answers. And we have, as we're coming closer and closer to the end, been talking about fighting for what we need in this 21st century. And so, Jennifer, these parents need to know how they can be activists on behalf of their children. What do you have to say to these parents?
This is one of the issues that's keeping me up at night right now. I could not agree more with David and with Maya about, this being the opportunity to look at, what has been the education achievement gap and disparities in quality education provided to persons with lower income as compared to more affluent people in living in more affluent communities, and thinking about reimagining education in America to bring it current. I mean, we're still dealing with, a kind of a mid-20th century education model. My challenge in this moment, though, is that that's not going to take care of the here and now. And so I think we need a both and approach. asking many of the parents who are the essential workers on the front lines in this moment to be activists is placing an additional burden on them. Some of them just really don't, for obvious reasons, have the bandwidth. It's very difficult to be out there as essential workers working, 35 to sometimes 60, 70 hours a week, and then have children at home and trying to, put food on the table and make sure that, that the sometimes the one or two laptops or tablets or smartphones, are helping them and helping ensure that they're getting the education that that the system is saying it's providing. It's hard for people to manage all of that. I believe that in this moment, this is the time when those of us who don't have some of these burdens need to step up and help to be advocates and activists for the children and the families who can't carry the burden by themselves. It's already been estimated that Black children have already possibly a year behind those who were struggling to begin with, a year behind just from the first 3 months of being out of school, compared to children from more affluent families, maybe only losing a third of the year. And now, as this remote learning continues and the systems across the country haven't figured this out, haven't really figured out how to teach children remotely, those gaps are only going to grow. And so I'm actually looking to what organizations, advocates and activists, some of the social organizations, what we can and should be doing in this moment to help teach our children. We've got, examples across the country of more affluent persons setting up these learning pods where they are paying educators $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 per child to come in and supplement the education that they're receiving through the public system or the private school system, or even pulling them out of those systems and teaching them in groups of 4 and 5. But our children aren't getting that. And so what can we as educated persons do, as our ancestors did, to make sure that our children aren't falling further behind? What education supports can we provide? How can we be the advocates in this moment, telling the school systems it's not enough to provide education, remote learning that we know is failing the children? What are you doing to supplement it with educational supports, mental health supports, and other supports? I think that we all have a role in this, and we shouldn't just leave it to the people who are already burdened, as they carry a lot of the burden for us.
Thank you. I want to now go to something that I'm doing that's somewhat unique. And people say that I'm a rebel rouser or, a rebel. Either way, I don't care. I like it. And this is something that I'm putting forward because we just watched a presidential debate. And I want us to look at ourselves as people of color, as people who may or may not be seen as marginalized from the outside and not be seen as powerless. My idea of whether or not I'm on WBAI, Law of the Land, or whether I'm writing books or teaching constitutional law or being a civil rights attorney or a playwright, whatever I'm doing, the theme is empowerment. And so fighting for what we need is what this panel is about. If you were president of the United States and you had the resources of this nation, you tell these people, empower these people, tell them how you would use those resources to do some of the things we've talked about today. And because we only have 2 minutes per speech, you have to make it deep and make it good. So go there as president, you powerful people, and tell people in your way, inspire, empower, and let them know how the resources of this nation could be used to make some changes. And let's start with Maya.
Oh, give me the hard, fine.
Yeah, right.
Thanks, Gloria. No, I love this question. Every single one of us has something to contribute to making this nation the strongest, the fairest, the most just and prosperous for every single person is here. And that starts by saying that means we put what we have on the table. If we have a large bank account, we put more on the table to help pay for those things. If we have know-how, we get invited in to share that know-how when we don't have as much cash, but we share it. And we also come together. We come together as a country recognizing, even in a crisis, even in one of the worst economic crises we've ever seen that has taken so many of the lives of our people, that what we do is we pull together to do the following things with those resources. We call on everyone to innovate, but we give you resources from the federal coffers to do it. And the first innovation becomes, we will create an incentive fund that provides money to blow the walls off the box of public education in a way that makes it diverse and integrated, but also innovative without the rules of high-stakes testing, but only with the impacts of our kids being able to be their full creative selves to contribute to solving big problems. That we will also invest in ensuring that everyone can afford a decent place to live, because we'll have a real housing program that, one, ensures that every single unit of public housing in this country is healthy, does not have rats, does not have mold, has working boilers, can help us lower our carbon footprints, but that we will also ensure that the communities in our country, every last one, has affordable housing so people have real choices about where they live, not only whether they can afford it. But we're also going to remember that part of how we created the middle class was we ensured that people could, when they were out looking for a job and having a hard time finding one, they got resources to ensure they could support their families and pay their rent. Because homelessness is not homelessness. Homelessness is eviction. And we can prevent evictions by ensuring that people have that safety net. And I'll say one last thing, and it's not the only thing, but I only have 2 minutes, which is that we still have people in this country who contribute every day, who do not have health care, who cannot see a doctor when they're sick. In New York City, it's 600,000 of us. And that we can fix that by ensuring that we have a public system that covers those who are not getting covered with an insurance card, And that also means that we create a healthcare system that exists in every community, because now we're not starving our institutions that have been willing to support the healthcare of people who didn't have health insurance. And in the end, we will measure our success by our cohesion, by our ability to demonstrate that we all have dignity, that we can all support our families, and we will do it together.
Thank you, President Maya.
Yes.
Yes, we are powerful people. We need to know that we're powerful. We need to share in that power. And as President David tells us, empowers us, inspires us, informs us, we've talked about so many of these issues. But if you were president of the United States and you had the resources of this nation, tell the listeners and tell your legacy. Remember, this is written in a book for people to know and read later, how they can fight for what they need. You're using the resources of this nation. President Davis, speak to us.
I support Maya's platform, but I would add one other thing. I think in Roosevelt's effort after the Great Depression and the rest, I'd like to see work as a central issue. It's one of the unifying factors across racial and economic divides, that every American would have access to a decent job and the respect it brings. And that was something that, obviously in the Great Depression, the notion that we would provide work opportunity for every American to rebuild their ability to have self-respect, to get a decent wage, to get the kinds of protections we provide, but work. The opportunity to engage in meaningful engagement and self-respect is something that I'd like to see available to every American, irrespective of race. It is the one thing that growing up I recognized that the most damaging thing to any individual growing up in Bed-Stuy or Crown Heights was to be without work and without the sense of worth that it brings to you. So that would be a central focus, along with the attributes of basic wage, health insurance, protection in retirement, but all based upon the notion that work was going to be available to every American citizen without respect to their race.
Thank you, President David. Fighting for what we need. We've been talking about political participation, poverty, reparations, police violence, the educational system, the criminal justice system. We've talked about all these issues, and our attendees can ask their questions in the chat. So ask your questions, put them in the chat about any of these issues raised, and there is so much more that we could talk about. However, as we go to our last presidential party, the presidential party of Jennifer, we have you go before all of us as president, using the resources of this nation, having heard from so many others. What is it that you would do using these resources? If you were president of the United States, what changes would you make to affect all these issues we've raised? And unfortunately, you have 2 minutes to tell us, inform us, and empower us. President Jennifer.
So the first thing that I would do is I would admit that I don't have all the answers. But I do know that, as David and Maya have talked about, that everybody has should be recognized as having human rights and economic rights. I would begin with establishing a living wage or a universal basic income for all Americans. Universal basic income allows people to, meet their basic living needs, whether they have a job or they've lost a job, and that helps people to manage and weather economic challenges. A living wage would ensure that they're not seen as being given a handout, but that they're earning wages that help them to meet all of their basic needs, whether they be health, education, transportation, childcare, housing, food, or otherwise. So I'd begin with a living wage or a universal basic income. And then I do the work, not having an appreciation for everything and what I don't know. I'd begin the work by having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where we as a nation center on, the original sin of racism and how it has been used in a capitalist society to perpetuate inequity, to begin to unpack what that has looked like, what that has meant, and then to center on advancing those reforms, those progressive policies that really do the work of ensuring opportunity for everybody, the work of addressing economic inequity, everything from, pay inequity in the form of gender and race-based inequity, fair tax policies, asset wealth building, and then moving on to, as Maya talked about, health and mental health inequity, and education inequity, housing, criminal justice inequality and inequity. But I think that we'd have to first, before we jump in there, own the original sin and all the sins that have been perpetuated in the many years since, so that we don't run the risk as we go from one president to the next when I'm no longer in office of sliding back, because we as a nation have recognized our sins and are trying to move forward.
Thank you. I felt empowered and moved and informed by all three presentations, Jennifer Jones Austin, Maya Wiley, David Jones, and now we turn to Q&A. And one of our questions goes to abolishing versus reforming systems that perpetuate racial, social, and economic inequality. What is the most effective path to abolishing some of these systems? So how do we go about doing that? And if we turn ourselves, and one of the phrases that I use is weekend warrior. If you take that job during the week that pays the bills and gives you happiness, but on the weekend you become that activist, what are you doing? What must they think about? How are they accessing the system to change it? And so if someone would like to go forward, I'm going to let this be a free for all. Who would like to go forward to tell people how they can actively change the system? And is it an abolishing of the system or a reforming of the system? Or does it depend on the system that they're attacking at the time? David,
I'll quickly share. So, I think let's talk about the war of position versus the war of maneuver, right? So war of position is where you fight the system by working with the system that is and kind of working from within. War of maneuver is essentially being on the outside and trying to, challenge the system and take it down and create something new. I think that it actually requires a bit of both. So many of our wrongs are so entrenched in our society, and they're embedded in our thinking and our values base. And it's not just the systems. Systems are perpetuated by values, mindsets, and beliefs. And so I think that we'd have to come at this from a both and. Voting, we begin with voting. Voting is one of the first ways that you do that. But then the other is getting knowledge, getting educated, and joining up with people who want to do things differently. So I'll start there.
Can I jump in on that and add?
Sure.
This is an add to that, because I love that, is we have to recognize that part of why we have systems that don't work for us as people of color and across that spectrum, and for low income people, is that we have also constructed a culture that does not see us all as one. And that to change attitudes, so you could tear down an institution, you could end it, and create something new, and yet recreate a different way in which you have inequality, you have oppression, so we have to be careful about remembering that what we have to do is require that behavior change. Because in order to get attitudes and hearts and minds to change, and this is just social science, this is just psychology, you have to change behavior. Think about smoking. The way we got a significant change in society's view of smoking is we simply made it hard to do in a lot of places, public places. We just said you can't do it in your office, and then you can't do it in a restaurant, and we made it hard. We have never made racism that hard. We have never required the behavior change. We had some victories that helped. So if you think about the fact that at a certain point in time it became that you couldn't be overtly racist, part of that was because we had Brown versus Board of Education, right? Because we had some victory that said we're going to force you to change your behavior. The problem is we really didn't actually require as we know, we didn't require all the behavior change. Whether we're talking about policing, whether we're talking about how we design schools, whether we're talking about job opportunities, there's a reason why you can apply to a Fortune 500 company and be less likely to receive an interview if you have a graduate level education compared to someone who is white and does not, based on what your name sounds like. That is behavior that we have not made absolute, because it's hard to prove race discrimination, right? So when we say the behaviors are no longer allowed, that's actually when we make more progress on the attitudes and on changing the culture. And so I just think it's not because we don't need some of these systems to radically change and be transformed. And some instances, yes, ending them and creating something new. It's just we can't assume that the something new will be better if we haven't actually said you can't do the wrongs in the first place.
Yeah. So
Yes,
just
David.
following up on that, and I go back to I'm the historian here. The reason anti-Irish behavior stopped was political clout. It became too damaging for people to run for office if they espouse that. We have to look at the political consequences for people who engage in racist behavior and penalize them if they go ahead with it. There has to be a stick here. I don't depend upon people changing their behaviors because they see enlightenment. There has to be economic and political consequence. And that's why we get into the voting issue. That's why we have to recognize this current election is critical and a litmus test for saying if you go too far against the groups we're trying to defend, we'll crush you. And it's the only thing many of this constituency will respect. I just look at my own PVA and their attitudes in supporting one of the most racist operations ever. The only way to deal with this is the hammer. They are not going to change behavior because of courses or getting educated in how things should be better or sympathetic understanding. There has to be consequences. They won't keep their job, that they won't advance unless they toe the line on this. It's the only thing I depend upon with this particular group.
Well, thank you. And of course, and this issue at hand right now with police violence and the fact that only a handful of police officers have ever gone to trial and fewer still ever convicted in the deaths of so many, as we said, over 1,000 civilians each year die at the hands of police. And although people have said it in our short time we have, if you could give a minute or so, this viewpoint of Black on Black crime versus the policing of people because they're more criminal. What do you say to people who say, well, if Black people didn't kill each other so much, then the police wouldn't have to kill them? Could you please just very quickly, and I know we're running out of time, speak to the difference between civilian on civilian crime and the government killing of a civilian? And if we could start with, and I think I would like to end with David, only because you gave us that very deep story about the incident that you remember as a child. If you'd like to begin, you can either way, but I would like to.
Well, this is an issue. I don't want to dismiss the problem of crime in our communities. But I always say, in the midst of the Great Depression, Bonnie and Clyde was not an accident. If you put enough pressure on a community with no resources and no options, a certain small percentage are going to turn to violence. And we have to suppress that and suppress it violently. But to suddenly give license to the overall abuse of everybody based upon that kind of behavior is a path that leads nowhere. That basically the thing that started to decrease the crime in the Great Depression was suddenly major programs to give people options. So this notion that somehow African Americans, Latinos are prone to crime, and you don't look into the root issue of economic drivers and recognize that certain proportions of the population are going to turn to preying on their own, is to be silly. But to suddenly generalize that to a whole population of people struggling, I think is the seeds of a racist approach. And again, I tell people, yes, let's use the police to make sure that people are safe in their homes and streets. But let's not use the police to stop fare evasion and marijuana arrests or selling loose cigarettes and basically engaged in community policing that leads nowhere.
Thank you. And I want to give everyone a chance on this one because I could see the enthusiasm you have to talk about this issue. We know that there's Latino on Latino crime, white on white crime. We know that people do things of this sort within their own group, and that's another form of domestic violence. We also know that the Italians, the Irish, and so many were given job programs, and we talked about the GI Bill, but people still have this sense that if only we went to school, if only we spoke a certain way, if only we didn't sag our pants, if only, as though we're bringing this on ourselves when it comes to the police violence targeted to African Americans. Jennifer, would you please speak to this issue? You're muted.
You're muted.
I was truly silent. I was saying that I'm not often silent. But this is one of these issues that I struggle with. I do agree with David, but here we are in October, Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and very little attention is being paid to the fact that Black women suffer and are killed at disproportionately higher rates from intimate partner violence than any other, segment of our population. And so it's challenging for me. Now, we live in a militaristic society, and that, and that with a practice that is centered on Black and Brown communities. We cannot hold these two truths. Let me say it differently. We shouldn't suggest that we have to first deal with Black on Black crime before we can deal with racialized policing in America. I don't believe that that's the case, but I do believe that we do need to center on the experience of, disproportionate domestic violence, intimate partner violence, the challenges that beset our children with respect to abuse and neglect, and that pervades every community within our nation. But when you take these abuses and these challenges, they're compounded by poverty stressors, by lack of access to health and mental health care. And so I agree with David, but I think that we have to try to figure out how we hold both and address both.
Thank you. And Maya, as we talk about these issues, and I know that most people go into policing to help people. I truly believe that. And I've taken a lot of flack over time because I still hold true to that belief, but I also know there are bad apples. I know that this city pays out millions upon millions of dollars in damages out of our taxpayer money because of the bad apples in the group. I know that there are great prosecutors, but there are bad apples who are using racialized systems in order to incarcerate those people of color in disparate numbers. But I also know that there are people who believe that but for the behavior of people of color, these things would not be happening. What do you have to say as we bring this to a close?
So we're talking about violence. And if we're talking about police violence, so who did Eric Garner kill? Who did Philandro Castile kill? Who did Romarley Graham kill? Who did Eleanor Bumpers kill? Nobody. Nobody. So this issue it's not about, I agree with you, Gloria, it's not, but I want to even get away from the framing of good cop, bad cop, because we know there are good people who sometimes do bad things. And there are bad people who sometimes do good things. So it doesn't really help us get anywhere to say bad or good. What we have to say is, there is simply no reason anyone should be dead. There's no reason Eric Garner should be dead. There's no reason Romarley Graham should be dead. There's no reason Eleanor Bumpers should be dead. And there's no way that this whole Black on Black discussion has any bearing on any of that, because they didn't kill anybody. Now, the point that everyone is making, with David and Jennifer making about violence, is yes, we have to look at the root causes of violence. And you know what? If you have 25% unemployment rate amongst people who are 18 to 24 in any community, you know what you're going to have? high crime and high violence. If you have mental health conditions and trauma and stress, including the stress and trauma of having endured violence and that trauma, guess what you're going to have? You're going to have violence. We know from data in New York City, when jobs fled the city to the suburbs and we left folks stranded without the public transportation to get them from the city to the jobs that fled to the suburbs, guess what happened? Crime rates went up. And the other thing that we don't talk enough about is the community-based organizations that stepped into the breach, sometimes doing so much with so little because they were so undervalued that they are a big untold story in the decline of crime rates. So if we really start having the conversation we should be having, the conversation is what our government, what our leadership does to invest in people so that those who have been the most disinvested are able to stop the violence.
Thank you. Frederick Douglass said, "Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will." I hope and I believe our attendees have been empowered, that they have been given some ground rules and inspiration to fight the good fight, because that's all we can do is fight the good fight with what we have. I think we've been given resources and we've been inspired to just go a little bit longer. If the ancestors can tell us anything at all, is that we may not know exactly how it's all going to come out, but it's going to be worth the investment. And we are all here as people. Our ancestors never knew our names, but they knew and hoped and prayed that one day we would exist. But we have to also invest in the future. So this is fighting for what we need, a platform for the 21st century. And hopefully this will be a shining star for other generations to follow. Generations will never know, but hopefully have been inspired by the work we've done today. Thank you so much, Jennifer Jones-Austin, David Jones, and Maya Wiley for joining me on this panel. And good evening.